He expected a black-edged letter delivered by a slow-moving country solicitor within the year, a tidy and final punctuation mark to a distasteful piece of business. He expected the remote, rotting estate of Stonefall to finally crumble into the moorland, taking its new, temporary mistress with it. He expected silence and the quiet satisfaction of a duty discharged with brutal efficiency. He did not expect her to live. He did not expect her to fight. He did not expect that when he finally returned, broken and seeking a grave of his own, he would find not a tomb, but a fortress, and that its queen would be the woman he had sent there to die. He did not, in all his cold calculations, expect to find his home. The solicitor's office was a room scrubbed clean of all sentiment. It smelled of dry paper, old leather, and the faint, acidic tang of forgotten legal disputes. Dust motes danced in the single beam of weak London sunlight that pierced the grimy window, illuminating nothing of consequence. It was a place for transactions, for the neat and tidy signing away of lives and futures, and Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, felt a grim sort of kinship with its stark functionality. He was here for a transaction, nothing more. He stood by the window, his back to the room, gazing down at the ceaseless, grubby flow of humanity on the street below. He did not wish to look at the other occupants of the office. He had seen them upon entering, a brief, dismissive glance that had taken in every necessary detail. The girl, Alara Vance, was a wisp of a thing. Pale, with hair the color of dishwater and eyes that were too large for her thin face. She was wrapped in a threadbare shawl that did little to conceal the shiver that periodically racked her slender frame, or the quiet, persistent cough she tried to stifle in a small, worn handkerchief. She looked precisely as advertised, sickly, impoverished, and utterly without recourse. Perfect. Beside her, practically vibrating with a wretched combination of greed and desperation, was her uncle, a man with a florid face and clothes that were a decade out of style, but still retained a pathetic echo of former quality. He was the one who had orchestrated this, who had written the groveling, near-incoherent letters to the ducal seat, reminding Alastair of some distant, thrice-removed kinship and a deathbed promise made by Alastair's father to the girl's father, a man long since dead. The promise was vague, a gentleman's assurance of looking after the man's daughter should she ever be in need. Now, bankrupt and orphaned, she was most certainly in need, and her uncle was leveraging that need for all it was worth. The solicitor, a dry stick of a man named Mr. Pembroke, cleared his throat for the third time. "Your Grace, if I might have your signature." Alastair turned slowly, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted energy. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, carved from years of political maneuvering, battlefield command, and the crushing weight of a title he had never wanted. The war in the peninsula had scoured the youth from him, leaving behind something hard and unyielding. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over the marriage contract laid out on the heavy mahogany desk. It was, by any measure, a monstrous document. It granted him a wife. In return, it settled a handsome sum on her odious uncle, clearing his debts and setting him up in a modest style to which he was certainly not entitled. It also made provision for the girl, the Duchess. He corrected himself with an internal sneer. It assigned her the estate of Stonefall, in the farthest, most desolate corner of Northumberland, along with a small but sufficient annuity for its upkeep and her own. An annuity that would, of course, cease upon her death. He picked up the quill. The scratch of a nib on the thick parchment was the only sound in the room, save for the girl's shallow breathing. He did not look at her. Looking at her would be a mistake. It might risk some flicker of unwanted humanity, some inconvenient pang of conscience. He was here to solve a problem. The girl was a loose thread, a forgotten promise that had inconveniently resurfaced at the worst possible time. He had pressing matters in Vienna, delicate negotiations that would shape the face of Europe, and he could not be burdened with a sickly, penniless ward. Marriage was the cleanest solution. It fulfilled his father's promise in the most absolute terms, silenced her grasping relatives, and, most importantly, removed her from his orbit. Permanently. Stonefall was the masterstroke. The estate was a ruin, a place that had been bleeding money for 3 generations, a pile of rock and rot that was more of a liability than an asset. He had been planning to let it collapse on its own. Sending her, there was a sentence, delivered with the cold, impersonal flick of a pen. The harsh climate and the house's notorious dampness would surely do what her frail constitution had already begun. It was a cruel thought, and he acknowledged it with a dispassionate sort of self-awareness. He had not survived 2 campaigns by being sentimental. He was a man who dealt in outcomes, and this was the most logical outcome. Your Grace, the uncle simpered, his voice slick with false deference. A momentous day, a truly joyous union. Alistair ignored him, his gaze fixed on his own signature, the black ink stark and final. He pushed the document across the desk towards the girl. You will sign, he stated. It was not a request. For the first time, she moved. Her hands, pale and fine-boned, emerged from the shawl. She reached for the quill, her fingers trembling slightly. He watched, detached, as she dipped it in the inkpot. Her eyes, which he had thought a dull brown, were in fact a startling, lucid green, like moss seen through clear water. They met his for a fraction of a second, and in their depths he saw not fear or gratitude, but a flicker of something else, something cold and assessing. It was as if she were the one measuring him, weighing his worth and finding it wanting. The look was so unexpected, so entirely out of place on that fragile face, that it almost broke through his carefully constructed armor. Almost. Then she looked down, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she signed her name, Elara Vance. The signature was not the spidery, uncertain script of a frightened girl, but a clean, angular mark of defiance. She pushed the parchment back towards the solicitor. She did not look at her uncle, who was beaming as if he had just won the lottery. She did not look at the Duke, who was now, technically, her husband. She simply pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at the single grimy window, as if the dreary London street beyond it was the most fascinating thing in the world. It is done, Mr. Pembroke announced with an air of finality, blotting the ink with a careful hand. Congratulations, Your Grace, Your Grace. Alistair gave a curt nod. The word congratulations was a grotesque absurdity. He had just condemned a woman to a slow, miserable death. He had purchased her, body and soul, to be rid of a nuisance. He felt nothing. That was the truly terrifying part. He felt a vast, hollow emptiness where something like guilt or pity ought to be. The war had taken those parts of him and burned them to ash. A carriage is waiting, he said, his voice low and resonant, a sound that carried an implicit command. It will take you to Stonefall. Now, the uncle's face fell. Now, Your Grace? Surely there will be a small celebration? A wedding breakfast? I am not hungry, Alistair replied, his tone dropping to a temperature that could freeze water. He turned his gaze on the man, and for the first time, let a fraction of his true nature show. The uncle visibly flinched, his simpering smile dissolving into a mask of fear. You have been paid. You are no longer relevant to this arrangement. Leave. The man practically scrambled out of the office, muttering about his niece's luggage, his duty done. He did not say goodbye to her. Silence descended again, thicker this time. It was just him, the solicitor, and his new wife, the Duchess of Blackwood. The title was a farce, a cruel joke played on a girl who looked as though a strong wind could carry her away. My Lord Duke, she said, her voice quiet but clear, without a trace of the tremor he had expected. He met her gaze again, prepared for tears, for a plea. He received neither. Am I permitted to bring my books? She asked. The question was so mundane, so utterly unexpected, that he was momentarily thrown. Of all the things she could have asked for, a doctor, a lady's maid, a warmer coat, she asked for books. There's a library at Stonefall, he said dismissively. Though he knew perfectly well it was likely a wreck, its contents turned to mildewed pulp years ago. My own books, she clarified, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. They're all I have of my father. He felt a flicker of irritation. It was a complication, a demand. He had expected passive acceptance. He had expected her to be a ghost already. Instead, she was asking for her books. He weighed the cost of refusal, a potential scene, a delay, against the cost of acquiescence. It was negligible. See to it. He clipped out to Mr. Pembroke, before turning his back on her once more. He walked out of the office without another word, without a backward glance. The transaction was complete. He had a duchess, and she had a place to die. He put her, and her strange, assessing green eyes, and her absurd request for books, from his mind. He had a continent to rebuild. The carriage ride north was a study in absolute silence. It was his own traveling coach, well-sprung and upholstered in dark, unadorned leather, but it could not insulate them from the pervasive damp that seemed to seep through the very wood and iron of its frame. Rain began to fall an hour out of London, a miserable, persistent drizzle that transformed the landscape into a watercolor painting of gray and brown, smearing the windows and drumming a monotonous rhythm on the roof. Alistair sat opposite her, a fortress of stoic indifference. He had not wanted to travel with her. It was an appalling inefficiency. But his own destination, a clandestine meeting with a spymaster near the Scottish border, made this the most direct route. He could deposit her at Stonefall and continue on his way, a neat severing. He had a mountain of dispatches in his valise, communiques filled with troop movements, political treacheries, and the delicate architecture of a new peace. He opened the leather satchel, intending to work, but he found he could not concentrate. Her presence was a silent, unnerving weight in the small, enclosed space. She was not crying, as he had half expected. She was not attempting conversation, for which he was grateful. She simply sat, ramrod straight, and stared out the window at the passing blur of sodden fields and skeletal trees. She had a small, worn valise at her feet, and beside it, a wooden crate that presumably held the books she had insisted upon. She had not coughed since they had left the solicitor's office, but her breathing was shallow, and the skin stretched over her cheekbones had a translucent, bluish tinge in the gray light. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been cracked and poorly mended. He found his eyes drawn to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. They were not the soft, useless hands of an aristocrat. The nails were clean but short, and there was a faint roughness to the skin of her fingertips, a slight callus on her index finger. The hands of someone who had worked, mended her own clothes, perhaps, written letters for an employer. It was another detail that did not quite fit the picture of a wilting, helpless invalid. It was an annotation of resilience he found irritating. Days blurred into one another. They stopped at coaching inns where he would take a private parlor, leaving her to eat alone in her room. He ensured she was fed and had a fire, but these were the actions of a man stabling a horse, not of a husband with his new bride. They were logistical considerations, nothing more. He spoke to her only when necessary, issuing curt instructions about departure times. She would respond with a quiet, "Yes, Your Grace," her voice as colorless as the rain. The farther north they traveled, the more the landscape frayed at the edges. The neat, tamed fields of the south gave way to rolling hills, then to rugged, unforgiving moorland. The sky seemed to press down on the earth, heavy and oppressive. The air grew colder, sharper, smelling of wet rock and peat. This was his land, Blackwood territory, a hard land for a hard people, a place that did not suffer weakness gladly. He watched her as she looked out at the bleak panorama. She was not dismayed. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity in her gaze as she tracked the flight of a lone hawk against the bruised purple sky. She seemed to be absorbing the landscape, cataloging its harshness, not recoiling from it. It was as if she recognized something of herself in its wild, untamable nature. On the evening of the fourth day, the carriage turned off the main post road onto a rutted, barely there track. The wheels sank into mud, and the coach began to lurch and sway violently. Branches, heavy with rain, scraped against the roof and windows like skeletal fingers. "We are almost there," he said, breaking a silence that had stretched for hours. She turned her head from the window. This is the approach to Stonefall. It is. There was no judgment in her voice, only a quiet inquiry. But he felt a need to justify it, which annoyed him. The estate has not been a priority. I see, she said, and then turned back to the window. An hour later, the carriage lurched to a halt. The coachman's muffled shout could be heard from outside. Alistair let down the window, and a blast of cold, damp air filled the coach, carrying with it the smell of decay. Before them, materializing out of the encroaching dusk and swirling mist, was Stonefall. It was not a house. It was a wound in the landscape, a great, Gothic monstrosity of dark gray stone that seemed to be actively surrendering to gravity. One wing had partially collapsed, its roof gaping open to the sky like a silent scream. The windows were either boarded up or stared out like vacant, black eyes. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the walls, prying stones apart, dragging the house back into the earth. The drive was a morass of weeds and mud, and the great oak door at the top of a set of treacherous, moss-slicked stone steps was black with age and damp. It was a tomb, a rotting tooth in the mouth of the moor. He felt a grim satisfaction. This place would do the job. He pushed open the carriage door and stepped out, his boots sinking into the grasping mud. The rain was heavier now, cold and stinging. He turned and looked up at the woman, still inside the coach. "This is it," he said, his voice flat. She gathered her meager belongings and, refusing the coachman's offered hand, descended with a strange, fluid grace. She stood beside him, a small, dark figure against the looming mass of the house. She did not gasp. She did not cry out in despair. She simply looked at it, her head tilted, that same unnerving, assessing expression on her face. The rain plastered her lank hair to her skull and soaked through her thin shawl in seconds, but she did not seem to notice the cold. The great oak door creaked open, spilling a sliver of weak, yellow candlelight into the gloom. A woman stood there, silhouetted. She was tall and gaunt, dressed in rusty black, her face a collection of disapproving lines and angles. This was Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper. Her letter of inquiry about the estate's future had been a masterpiece of passive aggression and barely concealed resentment. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. She curtsied, a stiff, grudging movement. Her eyes flickered to Alara, and a look of profound, undisguised contempt passed over her face. She saw what Alistair had intended her to see, a sickly, inconsequential creature, soon to be a footnote. Alistair felt a sudden, urgent need to be gone. The transaction was over. The delivery was made. His part in this sordid affair was finished. He turned to Alara. She was shivering now, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. Her face was deathly pale in the twilight. For a single, insane moment, he felt a pang. Not pity, something else. An awareness of the sheer, calculated cruelty of his actions. He crushed it instantly. Sentiment was a liability he could not afford. "The solicitor has been instructed regarding your allowance," he said, his voice hard, each word a stone dropped into a well. "He will manage all funds. You will want for nothing a lie. She would want for warmth, for health, for life itself. I trust you will be discreet." It was a dismissal, a final command. "Be quietly. Do not bother me." She looked up at him. The rain ran in rivulets down her face, dripping from her chin. Her green eyes were luminous in the failing light, and they held his without wavering. "And what is it you trust one will be discreet about, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying a sharp, cutting edge. "My living or my dying?" The question struck him like a physical blow. It was a sliver of glass, sliding straight through his armor. She saw him. She saw exactly what he was, what he had done, and she was not afraid to name it. He had no answer for her. There was nothing he could say that was not a lie or a confession. He did the only thing he could. He turned his back on her. He strode to his carriage, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. He did not look back as he climbed inside and slammed the door. He did not look back as the coachman cracked his whip and the carriage lurched into motion. away from the ruin and the woman he had just abandoned in its shadow. He stared straight ahead into the darkness. The image of her pale, rain-streaked face and her terrifyingly lucid eyes burned into his mind. Alara stood in the mud and watched the carriage lights disappear into the oppressive darkness of the moor. The sound of its retreat was swallowed by the wind and the rain, leaving behind a silence that was profound and absolute. She was alone, utterly, completely alone, in front of a house that looked like it had been built from despair and was held together by rot. The cold was a living thing, seeping through her wet clothes, into her bones, settling deep in her lungs. A cough rattled in her chest, a painful, tearing sound. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tasting the familiar metallic tang of blood on her tongue. The woman in the doorway, the skeletal housekeeper, watched her with an expression of grim satisfaction, as if this display of weakness was exactly what she had been expecting. "Get her things." The woman, Mrs. Finch, snapped at the coachman, who was wrestling with the crate of books. Her voice was the sound of rust and resentment. She did not address Alara directly. Alara drew herself up, straightening her spine against the wave of dizziness that washed over her. She would not collapse. Not here. Not in front of this woman. She lifted her chin and walked, one slow, deliberate step at a time, towards the stone steps. They were slick with a fine green moss, treacherous and unwelcoming. She placed her feet carefully, her hand gripping the worn fabric of her valise. Inside, the house was even worse. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, of cold, dead ash, and of something else, something like wet wool and slow decay. The great hall was a cavern of shadows, the single candle held by the housekeeper doing little to push back the oppressive gloom. What little furniture remained was draped in ghostly white sheets, and the stone floor was damp underfoot. Water dripped with a maddeningly steady rhythm from a dark patch on the high, vaulted ceiling, plopping into a puddle on the flagstones. "This way," Mrs. Finch said, her tone begrudging. She led Alara not towards the grand, sweeping staircase that dominated the hall, but down a narrow, dark corridor. His Grace specified the east wing. Alara understood immediately. The east wing was the one she had seen from outside, the one with the partially collapsed roof. He had chosen her accommodations with the same care a butcher might choose a slaughtering pen. The room she was given was vast, cold, and funereal. A massive four-poster bed with a threadbare canopy stood like a tomb in the center. The air was so damp she could feel it on her skin, a clammy, unwelcome touch. A single window, its glass warped and streaked with grime, looked out onto the black, rain-lashed emptiness of the moor. There was a fireplace, but the grate was filled with a sodden pile of old ash. A young girl, no more than 15, with a scared, rabbity face, scurried in and deposited Alara's valise on the floor before darting out again as if the room itself were diseased. A moment later, the coachman and a stooped old man grunted and heaved her crate of books into a corner. Then they too were gone. "Supper is broth," Mrs. Finch announced from the doorway, her arms crossed over her thin chest. "If you require it," the implication was clear, "it would be an inconvenience." "I do," Alara said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "And I require a fire." Immediately, the housekeeper's thin lips tightened. "There is no dry wood." "Then I suggest you find some," Alara replied, meeting the woman's hostile gaze. "Or do you intend for the new Duchess to freeze to death on her first night?" "I'm not certain His Grace would consider that discreet." She used his own word as a weapon, and she saw it land. A flicker of uncertainty, of fear, crossed the housekeeper's face. A duke, even an absent one, was still a duke. A dead duchess on the first night might raise questions, might bring unwanted scrutiny down upon them all. Mrs. Finch sniffed, a sound of pure disdain, but she turned and left. A short while later, the rabbit-faced maid, whose name she learned was Polly, returned with a scuttle containing a few pieces of damp, smoky kindling and a single, gnarled log. It took an age to catch, filling the room with acrid smoke before finally, grudgingly, producing a sullen, meager flame that seemed to generate more shadow than light. It did nothing to combat the bone-deep chill of the room. Polly brought a bowl of thin, greasy broth that tasted of little more than boiled water and salt. Alara forced herself to drink it, knowing she needed the strength. She was trapped in a nightmare, a gothic fantasy of crumbling castles and cruel husbands. But this was not a story. This was her life, and it was, she suspected, going to be a very short one. That night, she lay in the enormous, cold bed, listening to the house groan and settle around her. The wind shrieked around the eaves, a mournful, lonely sound. The rain lashed against the window pane, and the terrible, pervasive damp, crept into her lungs. The cough returned, deeper this time, a racking, painful spasm that left her breathless and trembling. She felt a profound, bottomless despair settle over her. He had won. He had brought her here, and the house itself would be his executioner. She was going to die in this cold, dark room, alone and unmourned. The thought did not even bring tears. She was too cold, too tired for tears. She simply lay there, a tiny, fading spark in a vast, consuming darkness, and waited. For a week, she drifted in a feverish haze. The illness that had clung to her for years, exacerbated by poverty and grief, now took full hold. The room became her world. Polly would scurry in and out, leaving bowls of broth and stoking the pathetic fire, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pity. Mrs. Finch appeared once a day, standing in the doorway like a grim specter, her presence a silent question. "Are you dead yet?" Alara's mind wandered. She thought of her father, a gentle scholar who had filled their small house with books and laughter before a bad investment had ruined them and a subsequent fever had taken him. She thought of her mother, long gone. She thought of the miserable years as an unpaid companion to a sour old woman, where she had learned that pride was a luxury she could not afford. And she thought of him, the Duke, his cold, empty eyes, the casual cruelty of his dismissal. A slow, hot anger began to smolder beneath the surface of her despair. He expected her to die. He had arranged it, planned for it. He was sitting in a warm, gilded room in Vienna, reshaping the world, while she rotted in a forgotten corner of his own lands. The anger was a spark, a tiny, defiant point of heat in the frozen landscape of her hopelessness. The turning point came on a morning when the rain finally stopped. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the grime of the window, illuminating the dust motes and the damp stains on the walls in merciless detail. Alara was awake, her head clear for the first time in days. Her body was weak, a fragile, aching thing, but her mind was sharp. A white-hot clarity burned away the fog of fever and despair. She could die here. It would be easy. All she had to do was nothing. Just lie in this bed and let the house and the sickness consume her. It was what everyone expected. It was the path of least resistance. Or she could live. She did not know why the thought took hold with such ferocious power. Perhaps it was the memory of his face, the cool arrogance with which he had discarded her. Perhaps it was the contempt in the housekeeper's eyes. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a core of stubborn, unyielding grit that had been forged in the fires of loss and hardship. She would not be a footnote in his life. She would not be a discrete problem that quietly solved itself. She would live out of pure, unadulterated spite. With a groan, she pushed herself up. The room spun, and black spots danced in her vision, but she gritted her teeth and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the icy floorboards, and a shock of cold shot through her, but it felt galvanizing real. She stood, swaying, her hands braced against the mattress. She was alive. She was breathing, and she was angry. Polly entered with the morning broth and gasped when she saw Alara standing. "Your Grace, you should be in bed." "Move my bed," Alara said, her voice a raw croak. "Move it to the center of the room, away from the walls. And find me a screen. Anything. To block the draft from that window." The girl stared, bewildered. "Now, Polly," Alara said, and there was a new note in her voice. a hint of steel. Polly, startled into action, did as she was told. It took both of them, weak as they were, to shove the heavy bed frame across the floor. The effort left Elara breathless, leaning against a bedpost, but a fierce sense of triumph surged through her. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. She had imposed her will on this room. "Now," she said, catching her breath, "give me my books, and paper, and ink, and every ledger, every account book, every scrap of paper related to the running of this estate. Bring them here." "But, Mrs. Finch," Polly stammered. "Mrs. Finch works for the Duchess of Blackwood," Elara said, the title feeling strange and powerful on her tongue. "I'm the Duchess of Blackwood. Do as I say." The transformation of Stonefall did not begin with a grand gesture, but with a small, defiant scratching of a quill pen in a deathly cold bedroom. Propped up in her relocated bed, wrapped in every blanket and shawl she possessed, Elara began her war. The enemy was entropy. The enemy was neglect. The enemy was the cold, suffocating weight of the Duke's indifference. Her weapons were ink, paper, and a mind that had been honed sharp by necessity. Polly, now her terrified but loyal co-conspirator, had unearthed a stack of ledgers from a damp, rotted desk in the abandoned estate office. They were a testament to decades of apathy. The pages were stiff with mildew, the columns of figures fading into sepia ghosts. The early entries spoke of a thriving estate, of sheep rents, timber sales, quarry profits. But as the years progressed, the entries became sparse, the profits dwindling to nothing, replaced by lists of debts and repairs that were requested but never funded. It was a story of slow, agonizing death written in copperplate script. For days, she did nothing but read. She coughed, she shivered, she drank the thin broth, and she read. She mapped the decay. She learned the names of tenant farmers who were years in arrears, not through defiance, but because their fields were waterlogged and their cottages collapsing. She read of a home farm that had once supplied the house with all its needs, now lying fallow, its buildings derelict. She read of silver and paintings sold off piecemeal by a previous, desperate steward. And she found, buried in a deed box Polly had dragged up from the cellar, a detailed survey of the estate from 50 years prior. It listed assets the current ledgers had long forgotten. Timber rights in a small, remote wood, fishing rights on a stretch of the river, and, most intriguingly, a small, disused slate quarry on the northern edge of the property. Her first letter was to Mr. Pembroke, the London solicitor. Her handwriting was shaky from weakness, but her words were firm. She did not ask. She instructed. She, the Duchess of Blackwood, authorized the immediate sale of a set of hideous gilt-wood chairs she had glimpsed under a sheet in the Great Hall, and 2 moth-eaten Flemish tapestries depicting a boar hunt. The proceeds were not to be sent to her, but lodged in a local bank in the nearest town, an account to be opened in her name. She also requested copies of all current tenancy agreements and a full accounting of her own annuity. She expected a refusal, a deferral to the Duke's authority. Instead, a week later, a letter arrived from a stunned but compliant Mr. Pembroke. The Duke, in his haste to be rid of her, had signed papers giving her broad, almost absolute authority over Stonefall and its revenues. He had never expected her to use it. He had never expected her to even read it. It was a stunning, careless oversight, and it was the key that would unlock her prison. With the first small trickle of funds secured, she began her campaign in earnest. She could not fix everything. The house was too vast, the decay too advanced. To even try would be to exhaust her meager resources in a month. She had to be ruthless. She had to think not like a duchess, but like a general surveying a battlefield. She had to choose where to fight. She summoned Mrs. Finch. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, her expression one of soured disapproval. The room was changed. A large tapestry, ugly but thick, had been stripped from a wall in the corridor and hung against the window, blocking the worst of the draft. The bed was an island fortress of blankets and books. Elara herself was sitting up, a ledger open on her lap, an ink smudge on her cheek. She looked less like a dying invalid and more like a determined, if fragile, field marshal. "Mrs. Finch," Ilera began, her voice stronger now. "We are closing the house." The housekeeper blinked. "Closing it? It is already closed." "Not like this," Ilera said, gesturing with her pen. "We are closing the west wing, the north wing, and the entire third floor. I want the furniture covered, the windows shuttered from the inside, and the doors locked. We will live in what is left. This wing, the kitchens, the servants' hall, and the main hall. We will heat only what we use. We will defend only what is defensible." The military language was deliberate. She saw a flicker of understanding, or perhaps just surprise, in the older woman's eyes. "There is no one to do the work," Mrs. Finch stated flatly. "There is myself, Polly, and old Thomas the groundsman. That is all." "Then we shall do it ourselves," Ilera replied. "And you will hire 2 strong lads from the village. Pay them out of the household accounts. Their first job will be to fetch dry wood. Their second will be to help Thomas begin repairs on the kitchen roof. A house that cannot feed itself is already dead." This was a turning point with the housekeeper. It was an order so practical, so grounded in the grim reality of their situation, that it bypassed resentment and went straight to common sense. A dry kitchen, a warm fire, these were tangible things. Mrs. Finch stood in silence for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over Ilera, the ledgers, the determined set of her jaw. She saw not an aristocratic fancy, but a desperate, practical plan for survival. "I will see to it," she said, and for the first time, there was no insolence in her tone. It was the grudging respect of one survivor for another. As the weeks turned into months, a slow, arduous transformation began. The house shrank, consolidating its life force into a defensible core. The great, echoing silence of the abandoned wings was replaced by the sounds of hammering and sawing in the inhabited part. Thomas, the groundsman, a man as gnarled and weathered as an old oak, proved to be the loyal lieutenant Ilera desperately needed. He had served Stonefall his entire life, and his heart had been breaking as he watched it die. In Ilera, he found a commander who did not weep over the decay, but who saw the life that still remained. When she was finally strong enough to leave her room, she went not to the dusty, derelict drawing rooms, but outside, into the raw northern air. Wrapped in a man's heavy coat she had found in a wardrobe, she walked the grounds with Thomas. Her London pallor was slowly replaced by a healthy color whipped into her cheeks by the relentless wind. The cough still lingered, a shadow of her former weakness, but it no longer racked her body. The simple, nourishing food from the slowly reviving kitchens, thick vegetable soups, fresh bread baked by Mrs. Finch herself, who had rediscovered a grim pride in her work, was building a strength in her she had not felt in years. She and Thomas stood before the wreck of the old kitchen gardens. It was a wasteland of tangled thorns and weeds. "It can be done," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble, kicking at a clump of frozen earth with his boot. "The soil is good. Sour but good. Needs lime. Needs turning. Hard work." "Then we will find the hard work," Ilera said. She took the estate's survey from her pocket, the paper fluttering in the wind. "It says here there's a small lime kiln near the south woods. Has it been used?" Thomas's eyes widened. "Not in my lifetime, Your Grace. But my grandfather spoke of it. It became a treasure hunt. They found the kiln, overgrown and crumbling, but structurally sound. They hired the village lads not just for chopping wood, but for digging. They found a seam of chalky rock where the survey said it would be. The old ways, the old knowledge of the land began to surface like a spring. Thomas, who had been a mere groundsman, became a foreman, his quiet expertise finally valued. Ilera's life found a new rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the estate. Mornings were for the accounts, for writing letters that were sharp, precise, and unsentimental. She dealt with the tenant farmers not with threats, but with practical bargains. She forgave a portion of their back rent in exchange for labor, a son to help with the garden, a husband to help thatch a roof. She used the small fund from the sale of the furniture to buy seeds and a pair of pigs. She reopened the account at the local blacksmith's, a man who hadn't seen a penny from the estate in a decade, and commissioned him to mend their broken plow. Afternoons were spent outside. She learned the names of herbs, the feel of the soil, the signs of a coming frost. She worked alongside Polly and a few women from the village in the burgeoning garden, her hands, once pale and soft, becoming calloused and strong. She found a strange joy in the physicality of the work, in the satisfying ache of her muscles at the end of the day. She was not just managing a house. She was building a home, a sanctuary, with her own two hands. The house itself began to change. The core rooms were clean, the fires burned brightly, and the air smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and baking bread. The drip in the great hall had been stopped, the patch on the roof above it a clumsy but effective shield of tar and slate scavenged from the collapsed wing. It was not beautiful. It was scarred and patched and bore the marks of its struggle. But it was alive. One afternoon, she stood in the study, a room she had claimed for her own, its shelves now holding her father's books alongside the estate ledgers, and looked out the window. A year had passed since her arrival. A whole year. She had arrived a condemned woman, a ghost in waiting. Now, she was the ruler of a small, self-sufficient kingdom. The loyalty of her tiny staff was absolute. Mrs. Finch ran the household with an iron fist, but it was an iron fist wielded in Alara's service. Thomas was her unwavering right hand. Polly, no longer a scared rabbit, was a competent and cheerful assistant. Stonefall was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress, her fortress, and she was its queen. She thought of the Duke, a distant, abstract figure now. She wondered if he ever thought of her. She assumed he had received the solicitor's reports, had seen the small but steady trickle of activity on the accounts. Perhaps he was annoyed that her annuity was still being drawn. Perhaps he had forgotten her entirely. It did not matter. His opinion was irrelevant. She had not survived for him. She had survived for herself. She had taken the ruin he had given her, and she had forced it to live. And in doing so, she had found a life she had never imagined possible. A hard life, a challenging life, but her own. The letter from Mr. Pembroke informing her of the successful leasing of the slate quarry rights to a consortium from Newcastle arrived on a crisp autumn morning, almost 2 years after her arrival at Stonefall. The income would not be vast, but it would be steady. It would be enough to hire a full-time stonemason, to properly repair the roofs, to perhaps even buy a few head of cattle for the home farm. It was the culmination of months of negotiation, of poring over old deeds and geological surveys. It was a victory. She allowed herself a small, rare smile as she put the letter down on her desk. The study was her sanctuary. A fire crackled in the grate, casting a warm, flickering light on the books that lined the walls and the neat stacks of papers on her desk. The room smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of the rosemary that grew in a pot on the windowsill. Outside, the wind howled, a familiar, comforting sound now, the voice of the moor she had come to know and, in a strange way, to love. She had not heard from the Duke in all this time. Not a single word. His existence had faded to a rumor, a name on a legal document. She was the Duchess of Blackwood in title, but here, at Stonefall, she was simply Alara, the woman who had made a dead thing live again. She did not know he was coming home. She did not know that the man who had left her for dead was now returning, seeking the very oblivion he had wished upon her. Alistair rode alone. He had left his retinue, his aides, and his title behind him in London, shedding them like a filthy, lice-ridden coat. For 2 years, he had been at the epicenter of power, a key architect of the post-war world. He had negotiated with emperors and plotted with foreign ministers. He had traded territories like playing cards and redrawn the map of Europe with a quill and a steady hand. He had been brilliant. He had been ruthless, and he had been hollowed out completely. The final betrayal had come not from an enemy, but from his own government, a shift in political winds that had rendered his carefully constructed alliances worthless. His work, the thing for which he had sacrificed his soul, had been dismantled for political expediency. He was left with nothing but a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. The ghosts of the war, which he had kept at bay with relentless work, now swarmed in the silence, their whispers a constant, tormenting chorus. He needed to disappear. He needed a place so remote, so silent, that even his own thoughts could not find him. And in the depths of his weariness, a memory surfaced. A pile of rotting stone in Northumberland. A tomb. Stonefall. He remembered the woman he had sent there. The sickly, pale girl. He assumed, with a distant, clinical detachment, that she was long dead. He had not checked. He had instructed his solicitor to handle the final arrangements and not to trouble him with the details. If Mr. Pembroke had sent word of her demise, the letter had been lost among the mountains of state papers. He pictured a small, neglected grave in the shadow of the crumbling chapel. It seemed a fitting end. Now, he was coming to join her, not in death, but in the silence of decay. He would go to Stonefall and let the rot and the quiet consume him, too. As he rode north, the familiar, harsh landscape of his homeland did not comfort him. It mirrored the desolation within him. When he finally turned his tired horse onto the track that led to the estate, he braced himself for the final, depressing confirmation of its ruin. But something was wrong. The track, which he remembered as a river of mud, was firm. The ruts had been filled with gravel, the overhanging branches cut back. It was a small thing, but it was jarring. It was a note of order in the symphony of decay he had been expecting. He spurred his horse onward, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He rounded the final bend and pulled his horse to a sudden, sharp halt. He stared. He simply stared, unable to process what he was seeing. It was Stonefall, but it was not. The monstrous, gaping wound in the west wing was still there, a permanent scar. But the rest of the house, it was whole. The main roof line, which had been sagging like the spine of an old horse, was now straight and true. Smoke, thick and white and smelling of good, dry wood, plumed from 3 separate chimneys. The windows were not vacant eyes. They were glazed and clean, and behind one, he could see the warm flicker of a fire. The great oak door was no longer black with damp, but had been scrubbed and oiled to a deep, healthy brown. The treacherous stone steps were clear of moss, and on either side of them, in large stone urns that he vaguely remembered being half buried in weeds, grew resilient, tough-looking shrubs with silvery leaves. The entire aspect of the place had changed. It no longer looked like it was surrendering to the earth. It looked like it was defying it. It had the air of a grim, battle-hardened fortress that had weathered a long siege and was now, impossibly, standing strong. He was so disoriented that he felt a moment of genuine confusion. Had he taken a wrong turn? Was this some other house? But no. The shape of it, the particular gray of the stone, the brooding presence of the moor behind it. It was Stonefall. He dismounted, his legs unsteady. He walked towards the house, his boots making a solid, crunching sound on the gravel drive. A man was coming around the side of the house, a wheelbarrow full of logs in front of him. He was a sturdy, weathered-looking fellow. The man stopped when he saw Alistair, his eyes narrowing. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked. There was no deference in his tone, only a wary appraisal. He was addressing a stranger, a potential threat to his domain. "This is Stonefall," Alistair stated, the words feeling alien in his mouth. "It is," the man said, his hand tightening on the handle of his wheelbarrow. "And this is private property. I'm the Duke of Blackwood," Alistair said, the title feeling like a costume he had forgotten how to wear. The man's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but the wariness did not leave them. He did not bow or scrape. He simply nodded. "Thomas, your grace." "I'm the groundsman," he paused. "We were not expecting you." The "we" hung in the air. "We." Not I. Not the house. "We." A collective. "I will see to my horse," Alistair said, gesturing vaguely towards the stable block, which he expected to be a pile of rubble. "The lads will take him," Thomas said. "The Duchess is in the study. This way." The Duchess. The words hit Alistair with the force of a physical impact. It took him a moment to even comprehend. The Duchess. She was alive. The entire, impossible transformation of this place, it was her. The sickly wisp of a girl he had left to die in the mud had done this. He followed Thomas in a daze. The man led him up the clean stone steps and through the great oak door into the hall. The change inside was even more profound. The air was warm and smelled of beeswax. The floor was clean, the puddle gone. The ghostly sheets were gone from the furniture, which had been polished to a soft sheen. A fire roared in the massive hearth that he thought had been unusable for a century. The house was breathing. Thomas led him down a corridor he remembered as being dark and foul, but which was now clean and lit by a runner of rush matting on the floor. He stopped before a closed door. "The study, Your Grace," Thomas said, and with a nod, he left, his footsteps receding down the hall, leaving Alistair alone in the warm, living silence. He stood before the door for a full minute, his hand raised to knock, but he could not bring himself to do it. What would he find on the other side? What kind of creature had she become? This woman who could command a resurrection. He felt like an intruder, a ghost in a house that had moved on from its haunting. Finally, he pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the warm, golden light of the fire and the soft gray light from the window. And at a large, scarred desk in the center of the room, her back to him, sat a woman. She was not the frail, trembling creature of his memory. Her shoulders were straight, her hair, no longer lank and lifeless, was pinned up in a simple but tidy knot at the nape of her neck. She was wearing a dress of plain, dark wool, but it fit her well, and it was the dress of a woman who worked, not of an invalid who languished. She was leaning over a ledger, her head bent in concentration, one hand absently twisting a stray strand of hair. The ink smudge was still there, a faint mark on her cheek, a badge of office. She was so absorbed in her work, she did not hear him enter. He stood in the doorway, a silent observer, and took in the scene. The room was a reflection of her. It was functional, ordered, and without pretense. It was a place of work, of purpose, and she was its heart, the quiet, steady pulse that had brought it all back to life. She was magnificent. He must have made a sound, a shifting of his weight, because she suddenly went still. Then, slowly, she turned in her chair. Her face was no longer thin and gaunt. It had filled out, the angles softened. Her skin was clear, with a healthy glow from the wind and the sun. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. The startling, lucid green was the same, but the expression in them was entirely different. The fear and desperation were gone. In their place was a calm, unshakable confidence, an absolute authority. She looked at him, and he felt as though he were the one being assessed, the one being weighed and measured. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He was a commander of armies and a mover of nations. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of this room, under the cool, unwavering gaze of this woman, he felt like a trespasser. He searched for something to say, for a way to reclaim the authority that had so clearly slipped from his grasp. The shock, the disorientation, the sheer, dumbfounding impossibility of it all coalesced into three stark, blunt words. "You are alive." Alara looked at him, the man in her doorway, the Duke of Blackwood. He was thinner than she remembered, the bones of his face sharper, more prominent. There were new lines around his eyes, etched by exhaustion. His clothes were travel-stained, his boots coated in mud. He looked like a man who had been pursued by demons and had only just outrun them. He looked broken. A dozen emotions warred within her. Anger, hot and sharp at his audacity. Triumph, cold and satisfying at the shock so plainly written on his face. And something else, something she could not name. A flicker of pity for the hollowed-out man he had become. She crushed it. Pity was a weakness she had learned to discard. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to stand there in the ruins of his own expectations. She watched the play of emotions on his face, disbelief, confusion, and a rising tide of irritation. He was a man accustomed to being in control, and he had just walked into a world where he had none. Finally, she inclined her head, a small, cool gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even and calm. "I apologize for the inconvenience." The dry, cutting wit of her response clearly caught him off guard. A dark flush rose on his cheekbones. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet space. He was trying to reclaim the territory, to assert his presence. It was a clumsy, futile gesture. This was her room. This was her house. He was the guest here, the intruder. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. He swept a hand out, gesturing to the room, to the entire, transformed house. Stonefall was a ruin. It was, she agreed, her voice placid. She did not rise. To stand would be to put herself on his level, to engage in a battle for dominance. By remaining seated, behind her desk, she maintained her position of power. She was the monarch on her throne. He was the supplicant at court. "I found it inconvenient, so I made some changes." "Changes?" He gave a short, harsh laugh of disbelief. "You have raised it from the dead." "Not quite," she said, a faint, ironic smile touching her lips. "The West Wing is still quite dead. I had it sealed off. It was a dreadful drain on resources." Her pragmatism, her utter lack of sentiment, seemed to infuriate him more than any emotional outburst could have. He had expected a wraith or a memory. He found a ruthlessly efficient administrator. He strode across the room and stood before her desk, looming over her, using his height and physical presence as a weapon, as men like him always did. In the past, it would have terrified her. Now, she simply looked up at him, her expression unbothered. "I left you here to," he started, then stopped, the brutal truth of his own words catching in his throat. "To die," she finished for him, her voice soft, but with a core of tempered steel. "Yes, I am aware. Your instructions were quite clear. As I said, I apologize for failing to comply. It has been a source of some considerable expense, I am sure." He stared down at her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was wrestling with a reality he could not comprehend. The woman he had written off as a fragile piece of baggage, a problem to be disposed of, was now sitting before him, calmly discussing the estate's finances and mocking him with his own cruelty. "Ow," he finally bit out. "How did you do this?" "The funds I allocated were a pittance, barely enough for a burial." "I am aware," she said again, her calm relentless. "I sold the hideous gilt chairs from the hall. The tapestries were beyond repair, but a collector in York seemed to appreciate the historical value of their decay. I found that some tenants prefer to work off their debts rather than be evicted. The home farm now supports the house, and the slate quarry, which you had apparently forgotten you owned, has just been leased. The first payment arrived this morning. It will be enough to see us through the winter and begin repairs on the tenant cottages in the spring." She laid it all out for him, a concise, devastating summary of her accomplishments. Each sentence was a testament to her will, her intelligence, and his neglect. She was showing him not just that she had survived, but that she had thrived. She had taken his scrap heap and turned it into a functioning enterprise. The power dynamic in the room had been utterly inverted. When they had last met, he had held all the power of his title, his wealth, his gender. He had held the power of life and death over her. Now, in this room, in this house, his title was meaningless. He was a stranger. He knew nothing of the running of this place, of the people who lived here, of the delicate ecosystem of survival she had built. His authority was a hollow echo. The proof of it came a moment later. There was a soft knock on the door, and Mrs. Finch entered, carrying a tea tray. She did not look at the Duke. Her eyes went straight to Alara. "Your afternoon tea, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice respectful. "I have brought an extra cup." Her eyes flickered to Alistair for a fraction of a second, her expression neutral, but conveying a clear message. "I have acknowledged the presence of this stranger, as you would wish." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. That will be all," Alara said. The housekeeper curtsied, a proper, respectful curtsy this time, and left, closing the door softly behind her. The simple, domestic exchange was more devastating to Alistair's sense of self than any argument. The loyalty of the staff, the smooth, quiet functioning of the household, it all revolved around her. He was an irrelevance. Alara calmly poured 2 cups of tea. She pushed one across the desk towards him. It was a gesture of civility, but also of power. She was the hostess in her own domain. He ignored the cup. I'm still the master of this house, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Of course you are, Your Grace, she replied smoothly, taking a sip of her own tea. You are the Duke of Blackwood. You own the stones, the land, the very air we breathe. But you are not the master of its life. That, she said, placing her cup down with a soft click, belongs to me. I earned it. He stared at her, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken things. He saw the woman she was now, strong and self-possessed, and he could barely reconcile her with the trembling girl he had abandoned. He had come here seeking a tomb, a place of quiet decay. He had found a vibrant, thriving world that had no place for him. He was the ghost here, haunting the edges of a life that had gone on, defiantly, without him. The exhaustion he had carried all the way from Vienna settled back over him, heavier than before. He had no fight left in him. Not for this. He sank into the chair opposite her desk, the one meant for visitors, for tenants, for tradesmen. The chair of a subordinate. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture of a defeated man. Why? He asked, the question a hoarse whisper. It was not how anymore. It was why. Why had she bothered? Why had she fought so hard? Alara looked at the man, slumped in the chair before her. The formidable Duke of Blackwood, looking small and lost in her study. And she gave him the only answer that was true. Because you told me to die, she said softly, and I decided I would not. The days that followed were a strange, undeclared truce. Alistair did not leave. He seemed to have no energy for it, no destination to go to. He was a ship run aground, his sails torn, his rudder broken. He became a silent, brooding presence in the house he owned but did not belong to. He took his meals alone in the formal dining room, a cavernous, cold space Alara had kept closed, but which he insisted be open for him. He would sit at one end of the long, polished table while she and her small household staff ate their simple, hearty meals in the warmth and camaraderie of the servants' hall. The contrast was a stark, daily reminder of his isolation. He wandered the house and grounds like a restless spirit, witnessing the evidence of her reign at every turn. He saw the neatly stacked wood piles, the mended fences, the clear, running water in the newly dug drainage ditches. He walked into the kitchen and saw Polly kneading dough, her face flushed and happy, a stark contrast to the terrified girl he dimly remembered. He saw Mrs. Finch directing the work of the household with the precision of a field marshal, a woman transformed from a resentful custodian of decay into a proud guardian of a thriving home. He watched Alara. He observed her from a distance, as she moved about her day with a quiet, focused purpose. He saw her in the garden, her sleeves rolled up, discussing the planting of winter vegetables with Thomas. He saw her in the study, her head bent over the accounts, a frown of concentration on her face. He saw her talking to the wife of a tenant farmer, her head inclined, listening with a genuine, unfeigned interest. She was not playing the part of a duchess. She was being won in a way that had nothing to do with titles or tiaras, and everything to do with responsibility and care. He was an obstacle, an interruption. When he entered a room, conversations would cease. The easy, comfortable atmosphere would evaporate, replaced by a tense formality. The staff were polite to him, as their duchess would expect, but their loyalty was not his. He was a foreign power, an occupying force in a land that had already declared its independence. This slow erosion of his authority, of his very identity, left him unmoored. He had always been the Duke, a man whose presence commanded respect and obedience. Here, he was simply a man, a tired, broken man in a house that had no need of him. The emptiness he had been running from had found him here, in this place of unexpected life. The storm began in the late afternoon of the 5th day. The sky, which had been a placid gray, turned a bruised and violent purple. The wind rose from a mournful sigh to a vicious, shrieking howl. The first clap of thunder was a sudden, deafening crack, as if the sky itself had split open. Then the rain came, not a drizzle, but a torrential, driving assault against the house. Alara was in the study, finishing the week's accounts. The storm was a violent one, but the house felt secure. The roof was holding. The shutters were barred. The sounds of the wind and rain were a wild but distant chorus. She felt safe within her fortress. Thomas knocked and entered, his face etched with worry. "The Duke, Your Grace." He was in the library. "The storm, he's not right." Alara frowned. The library was in one of the closed-off wings. It was a cold, dark, tomb-like room she had not entered since her first weeks at Stonefall. What was he doing in there? She followed Thomas, carrying a lit lantern. The corridor to the west wing was icy cold, the air stagnant and thick with the smell of dust and decay. The sound of the storm was louder here, the wind whistling through cracks in the boarded-up windows. At the end of the hall, the heavy oak door to the library stood ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a vast cavern of blackness, the only light the swinging beam of her lantern. The shapes of shrouded furniture rose up like gravestones. The room smelled of rotting paper and profound neglect. And the thunder. In here, without the warmth and life of the rest of the house to muffle it, the sound was immense, a physical concussion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Another clap, louder this time, rattled the window frames, and it was followed by a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the room for a split second in stark, ghostly detail. In that flash, she saw him. He was not standing, not brooding. He was huddled in a far corner of the room, on the floor, his back pressed into the angle of the walls, as if he were trying to force himself through the very stone. His arms were wrapped around his head, his knees drawn up to his chest. He was making no sound, but his body was rigid, trembling with a violent, uncontrollable tension. The image was so shocking, so at odds with the powerful, arrogant man she knew, that she froze. Thomas, behind her, swore softly under his breath. Another deafening crash of thunder. This time, a sound was torn from Alistair's throat, a low, guttural moan of pure, primal terror. It was not the sound of a duke. It was the sound of an animal trapped and wounded. The war. The realization hit her with absolute certainty. The peninsula, the cannon fire, the explosions. The storm had breached the walls of his formidable self-control and had plunged him back into the hell he had survived but never escaped. Thomas took a step forward. "Your Grace, stay back," Alara said, her voice sharp. She handed him the lantern. "Go to the kitchen. Have Mrs. Finch heat some bricks and wrap them in cloth. And make some tea, the strong kind. And bring a heavy blanket for my room." Thomas hesitated, looking from her to the huddled figure in the corner. "Go," she commanded, and he turned and hurried away. She was alone with him in the cavernous, thundering darkness. Her first instinct was to retreat, to flee from this raw, terrifying display of brokenness. This was his private demon, his personal hell. What could she possibly do? But then she thought of the house. She had faced down rot and decay, had brought order to chaos, had fought entropy with relentless, practical effort. This was just another kind of ruin, a human one, and she was the mistress of this place. Everything within its walls was her responsibility. She took a deep breath, her fear receding, replaced by the calm, methodical focus that had become her greatest strength. She would not coddle him. She would not patronize him with soft, meaningless words. She would treat him as she had treated the leaking roof and the sour soil, as a problem to be solved, practically and without sentiment. She walked slowly, deliberately across the room. She did not try to be silent. She let her footsteps echo on the bare floorboards, a steady, rhythmic sound, an anchor of normalcy in the chaos of the storm. She stopped a few feet away from him. He did not seem to be aware of her presence. His eyes were squeezed shut, his face a mask of agony. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low and even, pitched just loud enough to be heard over the wind. Alistair, using his given name, was a risk, an intimacy that felt dangerous. But Your Grace was a title for the man of marble. This trembling creature on the floor was someone else. He flinched at the sound of her voice, curling in on himself even tighter. "You are at Stonefall," she continued, her tone steady, devoid of pity. She was stating facts, grounding him in the here and now. You are in the library. It is the 23rd of October. This is a thunderstorm. It is rain and wind. It is not cannon fire. She spoke the words slowly, repeating them. A mantra against the madness. A flash of lightning lit the room again, and another boom of thunder shook the floorboards. He cried out again, a strangled, desperate sound. She knelt, not too close, but within his peripheral vision if he were to open his eyes. She placed her hands on her knees and simply waited. She did not touch him. She did not offer empty reassurances. She just became a fixed point in his swirling vortex of terror, a quiet, steady presence that did not demand anything of him. Minutes stretched into an eternity, marked by the percussive violence of storm. She continued her quiet litany. You are in Northumberland. This is Stonefall. My name is Alara. It is just a storm. Thomas returned, his arms laden. He placed the blanket, the hot bricks, and the tray with the teapot on the floor, and looked at her, his expression asking what to do. She gestured for him to leave, and he retreated, closing the door and leaving them in the near-total darkness, the lantern left behind on the floor, casting long, dancing shadows. She took the heavy wool blanket and, moving slowly, carefully, she draped it over his shaking shoulders. He flinched violently at the contact but did not throw it off. The warmth and weight of it seemed to penetrate his terror, a small, physical comfort. She poured a cup of tea, the clink of the porcelain a small, domestic sound against the roar of the storm. She held it out. Drink this. He did not move. It is hot, she said. It will help. Slowly, so slowly he uncurled. He lifted his head, and in the dim lantern light, she saw his face. It was slick with sweat, his eyes wide and unfocused, pupils dilated with a terror that was not of this room, not of this time. But he was looking at her. He was seeing her. His hand, when he reached for the cup, was trembling so badly that the tea sloshed over the sides. She steadied his hand with her own, her fingers closing over his. His skin was icy cold. The contact was electric, a shock of shared humanity in the cold, dead room. She guided the cup to his lips, and he drank, gulping the hot, sweet liquid down. She sat with him like that for what felt like hours through the worst of the storm. She did not speak again. There was nothing more to say. She was simply there, a quiet, unyielding presence, a lighthouse in his personal hurricane. As the storm outside began to subside, the thunder receding into a distant rumble, the violent trembling in his body began to ease. The rigid tension seeped out of him, leaving behind a profound, boneless exhaustion. He leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closing. The teacup slipped from his fingers, and she caught it before it hit the floor. He was breathing deeply now, raggedly, like a man who had run a marathon. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was the silence of aftermath of survival. He did not open his eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a raw, scraped whisper, the sound of a man who had screamed himself hoarse. Don't leave. It was not a command. It was a plea. The most vulnerable sound she had ever heard from him. From anyone. I'm not going anywhere, she said, and her voice was as steady as the stone walls around them. Dawn broke, pale and serene, over a world that had been washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of delicate pink and gray and the clean, earthy smell of wet soil. The silence in the house was deep and peaceful. They were in the study. Her study. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, she had managed to get him to his feet and guide him from the cold tomb of the library to the warmth and safety of her sanctuary. He had moved like a sleepwalker, leaning on her, his formidable strength gone, replaced by a fragile, childlike dependence. She had settled him into the large armchair by the fire, which she had kept burning all night, and had covered him with another blanket. He had fallen into a sleep of pure exhaustion almost immediately. She had not slept. She had remained in her own chair, across the hearth from him, watching the fire and listening to the sound of his breathing. She watched the proud, harsh lines of his face soften in sleep, saw the vulnerability he kept so fiercely hidden. She had seen behind the curtain, had witnessed the broken man behind the ducal mask. It changed everything, and nothing. He was still her captor, the architect of her misery. But he was also a man haunted by demons she could barely imagine. The two truths existed side by side, a paradox she could not resolve. As the first light touched the window, he stirred. He opened his eyes, and for a moment, they were clouded with confusion. He looked around the unfamiliar room, at the fire, at her. Then memory returned, and a dark flush of shame crept up his neck. He sat up, pushing the blanket away, his movements stiff and awkward. The Duke of Blackwood was reassembling himself, piece by painful piece. Alara stood up, her own body stiff from her long vigil. She walked over to the small table where the tea things from the night before still sat. Without a word, she began to methodically prepare a fresh pot. She filled the small kettle from a pitcher of water, set it on its hook over the fire, measured out the tea leaves. The simple, domestic ritual was an anchor in the charged silence. It was practical. It was normal. It was something to do. He watched her, his expression unreadable. The formidable mask was back in place, but she could see the cracks in it now. She knew what lay beneath. When the tea was brewed, she poured a cup and carried it to him. She held it out. He hesitated for a long moment before taking it, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was warm now. He stared down into the cup, as if the swirling tea leaves held the answers to some unasked question. "I have not," he began, his voice low and rough, "slept through a storm in 5 years." It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was a confession, a stark, unadorned statement of fact, offered up into the quiet morning air. It was an admission of a weakness so profound, so long held, that she knew what it must have cost him to speak it aloud. She did not offer sympathy. He would have hated it. He did not want pity. He had revealed a crack in his armor, and pity would only serve to widen it. He needed something else. He needed practicality. He needed strength. She simply nodded and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to let the morning light flood the room. She looked out at the rain-soaked but undamaged garden. "The roof held," she said. Her words hung in the air. It was a simple statement, but it was laden with meaning. The storm, his storm, had raged, but the fortress she had built had not broken. It had sheltered them both. It had held. He looked up from his cup, his gaze meeting hers across the room. And for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond arrogance or anger or pain. It was a flicker of grudging respect, a dawning awareness. He was beginning to understand. That morning marked a subtle but profound shift. The undeclared war between them was over. A truce, fragile and unspoken, settled in its place. He did not retreat back into his solitary, brooding state. He began, tentatively, to join the life of the house. He appeared for breakfast in the warm, bustling kitchen, taking a seat at the end of the long wooden table, his presence still causing a ripple of unease, but he made an effort. He spoke to Thomas, asking quiet, intelligent questions about the drainage project. He listened as Mrs. Finch detailed her need for a new supply of salt for the winter curing. He was observing, learning the rhythms of the world Alara had created. Later that day, Alara was in the garden with Thomas, assessing the storm's minor damages, a few broken bean poles, a flattened patch of herbs. She saw Alistair approaching, not with his ducal stride, but with a hesitant, uncertain gait. He stopped near a section of stone wall that had partially crumbled. "This will not last the winter," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. He ran a hand over the loose stones. "I know," Alara replied. "The stonemason is not available until next spring." "It does not need a mason," he said. "It needs labor." He looked at Thomas. "Show me where the stone pile is." And for the rest of the afternoon, the Duke of Blackwood worked. He stripped off his fine coat, rolled up the sleeves of his linen shirt, and hauled rocks. He worked alongside Thomas, his movements clumsy at first, then finding a rhythm. He was strong, his body hardened by years of military life, and he worked with a silent, dogged determination. Alara watched him, a strange feeling churning inside her. He was a man of immense power and privilege, a man who could command others with a word, and he was rebuilding a garden wall with his own 2 hands. He was not doing it to impress her, she realized. He was doing it because the wall was broken and needed to be fixed. It was a practical problem, and he was applying himself to its solution. He was learning her language. They worked together, the three of them, in a silence that was no longer a weapon, but a shared space of common effort. The only sounds are the chink of stone on stone, the grunts of exertion, the calls of the birds. At one point, he reached for a large, awkward stone at the same time she did. Their hands met, his large and callous from the rough work, hers smaller, but equally strong. It was not a romantic touch. It was the contact of two people engaged in the same task, a moment of grounding, of shared purpose. They both pulled back as if burned, a sudden awareness passing between them. But the moment lingered. They were no longer just the cruel duke and his victim wife. They were not even lord and lady. They were two people, a man and a woman, rebuilding a broken wall in a northern garden. They were becoming partners. The courier arrived 2 weeks later, a bolt from the blue, a messenger from a world that had ceased to exist for them. He rode into the stable yard on a lathered horse, a man in the king's livery, his presence as alien and jarring as a cannon shot in the quiet afternoon. He carried a leather dispatch case, sealed with the royal crest. Alara was crossing the yard, a basket of late apples on her arm, when she saw him. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She knew, with a sickening certainty, what this meant. The outside world, Alistair's world, had found him. It had come to reclaim him. The courier, seeing her, dismounted and bowed low. "Your Grace." An urgent dispatch for His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood. Alistair emerged from the stables, where he had been helping Thomas reshoe one of the plow horses. He had a smudge of soot on his jaw, and he was wiping his hands on a rag. He looked less like a duke and more like a blacksmith. He froze when he saw the courier, his face hardening, the comfortable ease of the past weeks vanishing in an instant. The Duke of Blackwood was back. The courier presented the dispatch case with a flourish. "From Whitehall, Your Grace. The Prime Minister presents his compliments and begs your immediate return to London. There is a crisis in the Austrian court. Alara's defenses, which have been slowly, cautiously lowering, slammed back into place with the force of a portcullis. Her posture straightened. Her expression became a cool, distant mask. She had been a fool, a naive, sentimental fool. She had allowed herself to believe that this fragile peace, this partnership, could last. She had started to feel something. Hope, perhaps. Trust. What a ridiculous notion. He was the Duke of Blackwood. His world was not this small, provincial life of mended walls and winter provisions. His world was Vienna and London, kings and ministers, crises and courts. Of course he would leave. That is what he did. He had abandoned her once. He would do it again. The past 2 weeks had been nothing but a brief, meaningless interlude. She set her basket down with a careful, deliberate motion. She smoothed the front of her apron. When she spoke, her voice was the formal, emotionless tone of a duchess addressing her duke, a stranger. "You will be needed in London, Your Grace," she said, her words clipped and precise. "I will have Mrs. Finch see to your packing immediately. The roads are clear. You should make good time." She did not look at him. She could not bear to. She was already bracing herself for the abandonment, for the return to the solitude she had almost forgotten. She was preparing to be alone again in her fortress. Alistair stood there, the dispatch case in his hand. He looked at the royal seal, the symbol of the world that had made him and then broken him. He looked at the eager, expectant face of the courier, and then he looked at Alara. He saw her standing there, so proud and so straight, her hands clasped before her, her face a perfect, polite mask of indifference. But he could see the truth in the rigid line of her shoulders and the faint tremor of her chin. He saw the wall she had thrown up around her heart, the walls he himself had forced her to build. He saw a woman bracing for a blow she had every right to expect. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, a final tectonic realignment. He weighed the two worlds in his hands. The world of power and politics and betrayal in London, a world that had left him hollow and haunted. And this world, this small, hard-won world of stone and soil, of warm kitchens and quiet purpose. This world where he had rebuilt a wall and shared a cup of tea, where a woman had sat with him in the dark and had not fled from his demons. He had come here seeking a grave. Instead, he had found a reason to live. He made his choice. With a calm, deliberate movement, he turned and walked towards the house. The courier and Alara watched, bewildered. He entered the study, his study, her study, their study. He went to the fireplace, where a low fire was burning against the afternoon chill. He did not break the seal. He did not read the summons. He dropped the entire leather dispatch case into the flames. The leather smoked, then blackened, then curled at the edges as the fire caught. The royal seal melted and dripped away like wax. The summons from the king, the crisis in Austria, the entire world of power and duty turned to ash. He turned back to the doorway, where Alara stood, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The courier was behind her, his face a mask of horrified astonishment. Alistair's gaze was fixed on Alara, only on her. "My duty is no longer to the crown," he said, his voice quiet but resonant, filling the space between them. "My duty is here." He closed the distance between them, stopping directly in front of her. He reached out and gently, tentatively, touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped and was tracing a path down her face. "With my Duchess," he said, his voice softer now, for her alone. "With my home." He looked into her luminous green eyes, the eyes that had seen his brokenness and had not turned away. "Alara," he whispered the name of Val. "You are my home." The wall she had built so high, the fortress she had constructed around her heart, did not just crack. They crumbled. They dissolved into nothing. The sob that broke from her was not one of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming release. The tears she had never allowed herself to shed, for her lost family, for her years of poverty, for the cold abandonment, for the lonely struggle, finally came. She did not collapse. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, her hands clutching the front of his rough shirt. And he wrapped his arms around her, holding her not as a possession, not as a convenience, but as an equal, a partner. He held her as if he were the one being anchored, as if she were the one keeping him from being swept away. They stood there for a long time, two broken, solitary people who had somehow, against all odds, built something whole together. They were a permanent fixture against the coming winter, held fast in the heart of the house that was, like them, scarred and patched and imperfect. The house that was fiercely, defiantly alive, and now, finally, complete.